In February of 2014, detectives with the Illinois State Police had a serious problem. For the last 6 weeks, they, along with several other police departments, had been investigating a particularly unsettling murder case out of Clark County. Frustratingly, it was feeling like no matter what they tried, the investigation just wasn't coming together. This wasn't due to a lack of suspects or motives. There was no shortage of either of those. Actually, that was part of the issue. There were a ton of different leads, but there was really no hard evidence, meaning that the case was kind of being pulled in all sorts of different directions. As it turned out, investigators were about to get the answers that they were looking for, though it would happen almost completely by accident. It started when they were called about a different, seemingly unconnected incident, only to discover that the trail led right back to their original crime scene. At 12:28 on the morning of January 15th, 2014, emergency responders in the small city of Casey, Illinois, began receiving 911 calls about a house fire. Residents on the 700 block of East Jefferson Avenue said that they could see flames pouring out of one of the residences there. They weren't sure if anyone was inside, but it looked like the fire was spreading rapidly within. When firefighters arrived minutes later, flames had almost completely engulfed the front of the unassuming single-story home. This included the front door, which was completely blocked by a wall of smoke and fire. At first, it looked like things might be okay. Firefighters managed to contain and extinguish the blaze fairly quickly, and the actual structure of the residence remained mostly intact. Unfortunately, the situation was about to get a lot more disturbing. Upon making their way inside, firefighters almost immediately spotted a man lying in the middle of the home's living room. He was on the floor about equal distance from a couch and a black leather recliner, and it was obvious that he was dead. Though the living room was by far the area of the house that had been the most gutted by the fire, when firefighters took a closer look at the body, they knew that whatever had happened here, it wasn't an accident. This man hadn't died from burns or smoke inhalation. He was lying in a pool of blood and had clearly been the victim of a savage attack. After being called to the scene, detectives were able to confirm the deceased man's identity. The chief of the Casey Police Department, Mark Jenkins, realized that he knew the victim personally. He was the 54-year-old owner of the house, Gregory Collins, though everyone locally called him by his middle name, Scott, or Scotty. The injuries that Scott had suffered were absolutely brutal. He had been stabbed 28 times, his throat had been cut, and part of his abdomen had been sliced open. The sheath from a knife was found next to his body, but the weapon itself was missing. While there was already no question that this was a murder, there was still one heartbreaking discovery left to be made inside the burned-out residence. As police were searching the rest of the house for additional clues, they eventually made their way down into the basement. It was here, on the unfinished concrete floor, that they found the body of Scott's beloved German Shepherd, Gretchen. Like Scott, Gretchen had died from multiple stab wounds. Detectives also found signs of a struggle in the basement, suggesting that this is where the crime had likely started. The fire, it seemed, had merely been an attempted cover-up. Finding Gretchen's body was another huge gut punch for investigators. You see, she was actually how a lot of people in the area knew Scott, including the police chief. Scott and Gretchen were rarely ever apart and could often be seen on walks together in the neighborhood. Scott loved his dog more than anything else in the world, and based on the blood evidence in the basement, it looked like she had died trying to protect him. Given the vicious nature of what had happened, detectives concluded that there was no way that this crime was random. To them, this looked incredibly personal. It looked like rage. If that were true, though, the next question was obvious. Who could have hated Scott and Gretchen so much that they would have wanted to kill them in such an awful way? While some members of the investigative team continued to process the crime scene, detectives with the Casey Police Department began the awful task of breaking the news about the murder to Scott Collins' loved ones. During these conversations, they also asked the 54-year-old's friends and family members as many questions as they could about his life. They were joined by detectives with the Illinois State Police, who had now been brought on to assist due to the severity of the crime. Here is some of what they learned. Scott was born in 1959 in Mattoon, Illinois, a city just about a 30-mile drive northwest of Casey. He had spent most of his childhood in the Casey and Martinsville areas, attending and graduating from Martinsville High School in the late 1970s. It was also during this time that he developed some of his lifelong passions, things like deer hunting, coin collecting, and motorcycles. Immediately after finishing school, Scott became an iron worker and joined the local No. 44 union. He was based mostly out of Cincinnati and Terre Haute, Indiana. However, his work eventually took him all over the Midwest and southern United States. As you might imagine, the jobs could be backbreaking and extremely tough, but Scott loved what he did. He especially enjoyed working on big construction projects, things like skyscrapers, power plants, and bridges. It was partly for this reason that he was given the nickname Big Iron by his coworkers. Another reason was his larger-than-life personality. According to those that knew him, Scott was always fun-loving and full of life. He made friends very easily, had a good sense of humor, and was the kind of person who liked to help and share his knowledge with others. On the job site, Scott was always the guy who could be counted on to boost morale. Whether they were working in the freezing cold or sweltering heat, he was out there telling jokes and sharing anecdotes. In a newspaper article we came across, a friend and fellow ironworker who knew him for many years fondly remembered Scott's gift for storytelling. He also said that Scott was particularly known for his ability to make off-the-wall funny comments while keeping a completely straight face. Because of Scott's natural gift for talking and relating to people, perhaps unsurprisingly, he was also popular with women. According to one former girlfriend, he used to have a saying, quote, "Deer feared him, women wanted him, and men hated him." While Scott never had problems finding romantic partners, it seems that maintaining those relationships for the long term was a different story. In fairness to him, though, it seems that not all of this was because he enjoyed being a ladies' man. As previously mentioned, he also traveled a lot for work, which can be tough for anyone to balance. This is also part of the reason why Scott's dog, Gretchen, was so important to him. She was his true companion in life, the one who went with him everywhere and was always there for him. Scott's friends and family told police that he had never really settled down, so to speak, but his life had changed quite a bit in the last couple of years. He had been forced to retire from his career as an iron worker after more than 30 years due to a couple of bad injuries, and he had also been involved in a serious car accident. The head-on collision had left Scott with a brain injury, with some sources we came across saying that it had been a miracle that he had survived. Scott had ended up with a large settlement as a result of the accident, so he was doing more than fine financially, but the incident also left him with chronic pain issues. Understandably, detectives were very intrigued after hearing about the money from the car crash settlement. They were even more interested when they learned that Scott wasn't exactly secretive about the fact that he had come into a large amount of cash. Being the open book that he was, Scott often talked about his accident and the resulting payout he had received. Those that knew him said that at times he could be pretty reckless about this. He would joke about putting people into his will when he was hanging out at local bars, and also told people about his coin and gun collections, his Harley-Davidson motorcycle, and other expensive items that he owned. In fact, when many of Scott's friends and family members heard about his murder, this was their first thought, that whoever had done this was after the 54-year-old's money and valuables. A few also had an idea as to who in particular might have coveted Scott's possessions. His brother, Lonnie. Now, Lonnie's name came up a number of times in these initial conversations, but there was one specific interview detectives conducted that really stood out. It was with one of Scott's close friends, Heather. Heather told investigators that Scott and Lonnie didn't really get along. The brothers couldn't have been more different and often fought when they were together. For most of the time that she had known Scott, Heather said that he and Lonnie hadn't even been in regular contact with one another. That had abruptly changed, though, as soon as Scott received that big settlement. Heather stated that she had been worried that Lonnie was only interested in Scott's money even before his murder. Recently, Lonnie had asked for a loan, and she said that Scott told her his brother got extremely angry when he refused to give him anything. What made Heather more suspicious than anything, she claimed, was how quickly Lonnie had shown up following the crime. He lived about a 2-hour drive away in Springfield, but she said he had trekked it down to Casey in record time. Not only that, but when Lonnie had called upon finding out about the murder, it seemed to her like he was primarily concerned with his brother's will, his life insurance policy, and other things like that. After hearing all of this, detectives looked into Lonnie a little bit further on their own. What they found was pretty concerning. Just a few days before Scott was killed, Lonnie had come down to Casey to help him rewrite a will. As part of that will, he was apparently going to get a part of Scott's gun collection as well as other valuables. The timing seemed a little convenient, to say the least. Illinois State Police traveled to Springfield, where they were able to question Lonnie. He said that he was nowhere near Casey at the time of the crime and had been home alone all night. He also rejected the characterization that had been painted of him as someone who was only interested in money. He said that he loved Scott, even if they didn't always have the best relationship. At the end of the day, they were brothers, and he would have done anything to change what had happened. Detectives weren't sure what to make of what Lonnie told them, especially because of his obviously weak alibi. That being said, when they looked into his cell phone records, these did seem to verify that he had been in Springfield on the night of January 14th, as well as the following morning. The cell data wasn't enough to completely rule Lonnie out, but it was enough that police decided to move on and look into some other suspects. They wouldn't have to search for long. In fact, the next name investigators were given came from Lonnie himself. Lonnie suggested that detectives look into his brother's ex-girlfriend, a woman named Christy Lennox. He said that the pair had broken up a little while ago, but he knew that their relationship had been turbulent when they were together. According to Lonnie, Christy had a really bad temper. Scott had put it to him this way: "You never knew what you might get when Christy woke up." Lonnie explained that Christy had moved from Kentucky to be with Scott, and she was extremely angry with him when he ended things between them. Given his brother's reputation as a ladies' man, Lonnie wondered if maybe Christy had gotten jealous and had decided to get revenge. Police were definitely interested in what Lonnie had to say, especially since this could explain some of what they had found at the crime scene, particularly the over-the-top, rage-filled way in which it appeared Scott and Gretchen had been killed. Before detectives could even seriously look into this, though, 2 more potential suspects were brought to their attention. The first was a friend of Scott's named TJ Duvall. The second was a neighbor of his named Kevin Black. Like Lonnie, TJ Duvall's name came up as someone who might have been interested in Scott's money. Several people who were close to the 54-year-old had said that they had been spending a lot of time together in the lead-up to the murder, but that they had also recently had a falling out. The exact nature of what had happened between the men wasn't clear. However, police were told that it had something to do with money and tools. TJ and Scott had done some odd handyman-type jobs together, during which TJ had somehow come to owe Scott a couple $1,000s. Scott was apparently getting tired of waiting for TJ to pay him back and was planning on confronting him. Some of those who detectives spoke to said that they were worried when Scott mentioned this. TJ was known to be involved with a pretty rough crowd, and he was also quite a bit bigger than Scott. Scott's friend Heather, who I mentioned before, provided another detail that made TJ look even more suspicious. In the final text exchange that she had had with Scott, he said that he was going over to TJ's house. This message had been sent at around 10:40 p.m. on January 14th. In other words, less than 2 hours before Scott's house had been found engulfed in flames. Detectives brought TJ in for questioning and asked him about everything that they had heard. He not only denied having anything to do with the murder, but also said that authorities had been given bad information. For starters, TJ claimed that he and Scott never had a falling out. They were perfectly fine, and there wasn't a bunch of tension between them as others had claimed. As far as money went, TJ said that Scott had helped him out of a really tight spot. A little while ago, he and the mother of his child had split up, and he was worried about losing his house. Out of the blue, Scott had given him an envelope with $600 inside. He told TJ not to worry and that everything was going to be all right. TJ said that Scott was a good friend, and he was forever grateful for this. TJ admitted that Scott had stopped by his trailer on the night of January 14th, but he said he hadn't stayed that long. He seemed genuinely stunned to learn that he was one of the last people to see Scott alive. When police were told about Scott's neighbor, Kevin Black, an entirely new motive was introduced into the mix. They were told that Kevin was a drug dealer and that Scott may have been buying painkillers from him. As I mentioned previously, Scott's car crash, as well as his work-related injuries, had left him in chronic pain. Because of this, he had been prescribed medication, though sadly, as is the case with so many people, he had eventually started abusing the drugs. It's hard to tell exactly to what degree this was happening, because admittedly we weren't able to find very much information about it in our research for this story. Still, according to Lonnie, it was enough that several doctors had cut Scott off due to him presenting signs of drug-seeking behavior. That's when Scott had allegedly started buying painkillers from Kevin. Investigators wondered, had the men gotten into some sort of dispute over the drugs that had spiraled out of control? Detectives interviewed Kevin, but unfortunately, they weren't able to get much information out of him. They tried to reassure him that they didn't care about the drug dealing and that their primary concern was solving Scott's murder, though understandably he was nervous and didn't really seem convinced. He basically said that he knew Scott, they were friends, but that he didn't know anything and that he wasn't home when the murder happened.
Basically, I want to just ask you a couple questions about the death of Gregory Scott Collins, who was a neighbor of yours. Okay. Did you know Scott? Did he go by Scott to you? Or?
Yeah, I know Scott, Big Iron.
Right.
Yeah, me and him were friends, acquaintances, neighborhood.
Okay. We're not the drug police. We're homicide detectives. What I'm investigating is the death of Gregory Scott Collins. Don't lie about it if we're getting into something.
Okay.
Like it is what it is.
Personally, right now, I'm having an anxiety attack. Cops freak me out.
Well, I always try and treat people with respect, and obviously, it's a pretty serious deal.
Oh, yeah.
You didn't hear or see anything that night, or?
No. I wasn't home at the time.
Okay.
The tip about Kevin Black was far from the last lead that authorities would receive. Many residents of KZ were deeply disturbed by the idea of a killer being loose in their midst, especially since they weren't used to this type of crime. Prior to this, the small city was known mainly for its collection of oversized roadside attractions, some of which had earned Guinness World Records. Now they were making headlines for a horrifying murder. Naturally, the climate of fear sent the local rumor mill into overdrive. Wanting to help in any way they could, people reported these rumors to police on the off chance that they might lead to a break in the case. While this was undoubtedly done with good intentions, the effect was that as days turned into weeks, detectives found themselves sorting through higher and higher volumes of less and less compelling theories. Theories such as that Scott had been killed during the middle of a wild swinger party at his house. One rumor went that Scott wasn't even actually dead. The whole thing, the murder, the fire, all of it, had been staged because he was an FBI agent who was going into protective custody. Even with the more credible leads I already covered, though, detectives were in a tight spot, because there was really nothing concrete either confirming or ruling any of these suspects or motives out. There were kind of just these loose threads going out in all directions. Fortunately, the case was about to hit a turning point. Funnily enough, it started when police received yet another tip, one that would quickly stand out from all of the others. A couple of weeks into the investigation into Scott Collins' murder, detectives received a letter at the KZ Police Department. The letter was anonymously written, though it had been stamped locally, suggesting that whoever had sent it was likely someone who lived in the area. The letter said that police needed to look into a specific suspect, a young man named Tommy Messina. Now, Tommy was someone who authorities had definitely heard of before. He was a 19-year-old who had grown up in the area and who'd been in trouble with the law a number of times. However, Tommy had never done anything violent. His arrests and convictions were mostly for things like theft and property damage. And up until now, his name hadn't come up at all in the case. Detectives were skeptical of the letter for at least one additional reason. The anonymous sender went on to allege that Scott and Tommy were involved in some sort of sexual relationship. At this point, police weren't really in a position to turn down new leads, so they decided to look further into the tip. Sure enough, all of those close to Scott flatly rejected the idea of him being in a relationship with another man. That being said, they didn't think the lead was entirely baseless. You see, at least a couple of Scott's friends and family recognized the name Tommy Messina. Lonnie explained to detectives that he knew who Tommy was, because for several years, Tommy had lived next door to Scott. Specifically, he recalled Scott telling him that he felt bad for Tommy, and said that it looked like he had a pretty rough childhood. Lonnie didn't know the whole story, but he shared whatever he could remember from things that Scott had mentioned about the situation. Tommy had moved to KZ when he was about 5 years old to live with his grandfather. The grandfather was in bad health and his home wasn't well cared for, to the point where really no one should have been living there, least of all a small child. Scott had said that it didn't appear that anyone was really around to look after Tommy. Lonnie stated that his brother would do what he could to help out. He'd give him $20 here or there, just to make sure that he could get some food or other essentials if it looked like he needed it. As Tommy got older, he wasn't around as much, and eventually it seemed like he had moved out. While Tommy had no fixed address, police learned that he had a girlfriend in the area and also stayed with other family members. After finding him at one of these addresses, they were able to ask him some questions about Scott's murder. Tommy was polite and cooperative, and told detectives that he read about what had happened in the local papers. He denied having any kind of close relationship with Scott, though, saying that they were just neighbors, nothing more. As for his whereabouts on the night of the crime, he said that he was with his girlfriend. At first, this whole thing seemed like it might just be yet another loose end. Like all of the other suspects, there was no real evidence connecting Tommy to the murder. That was, until the case took an unexpected turn. On February 25th, 2014, so almost 6 weeks to the day that Scott Collins was killed, Illinois State Police received a call from their law enforcement counterparts in Shelby County. They were in the middle of investigating a vehicle theft, but they had stumbled across something that they thought state police might want to know about. A few weeks earlier, a man named Greg Light had reported his truck stolen. Greg lived in the small village of Toledo, located about a 20-minute drive west of KZ, and his truck had been stolen right out of the driveway of his home. Another car was found crashed about a block and a half from Greg's house around this same time, one that was also later found to be stolen. Police had quickly assumed that these two theft cases were related. Specifically, they theorized that whoever was responsible had likely taken the first vehicle, crashed it in Toledo, and then stolen Greg's truck to escape the area. This was backed up by cigarette butts that were found in Greg's garage, which suggested that the culprit had hidden out there for a bit before committing the second theft. That being said, initially no one really had any reason to believe that the vehicle thefts were connected to anything larger. That was until they got that call from Shelby County Police. The reason investigators there had called Illinois State detectives was because they had since found Greg Light's truck, and where it had been found was quite interesting. It had been left in an apartment complex very close to where Tommy Messina's grandmother lived. This was interesting for two reasons. First, as previously mentioned, Tommy had a history of committing thefts. In particular, though, he was known for stealing vehicles, driving them around for a bit and then leaving them abandoned. The second reason was even more compelling. That first car I mentioned, the one that had been crashed before the truck was stolen? Turns out that it had been taken from a residence in KZ, one that was located only a couple of blocks from Scott Collins' house. After receiving this information, Illinois State Police and detectives with the KZPD immediately began looking for Tommy Messina again. This time, he ended up being quite a bit harder to track down. Authorities spoke to a number of the 19-year-old's relatives, but they all claimed that they hadn't heard from him in some time. This included Tommy's grandmother, the one who lived close to where Greg's truck had been found. She invited detectives in, gave them some milk and cookies, and was very kind to them, but ultimately said she hadn't seen her grandson in close to 2 years. Investigators were struck by how sweet of an old lady Tommy's grandma was, until they found out that in addition to milk and cookies, they had been fed a pack of lies. You see, it turned out that Grandma had driven Tommy to the city of Joliet quite recently. They learned this from Tommy's mother, Mary, who also revealed that she knew quite a few details about Scott's murder, and that her son was involved. Using the information Mary provided, Tommy was arrested in Joliet. When detectives sat down for their second interview with Tommy, things started off slow. Once again, the 19-year-old denied having anything to do with the murder, and for a while, things went around in circles. Eventually, though, investigators decided to confront Tommy with what his mother had told them.
We also went and talked to your mom. She said that you told her that you killed somebody. You went down in the basement, you got in a fight with the dog, you stabbed the dog. I'm just telling you what she told us, okay? She says that you actually said that you killed him, and that you set his house on fire to cover your tracks, and you could see flames in your rearview mirror as you're driving away. So this is what she's told us, okay? Now, by her telling us this, Tommy, she's created a whole lot of problems for a whole lot of people.
Yes.
While this got Tommy talking, it was when authorities brought up the situation with his grandmother that they really started getting a response. They told him, you put her in a really bad situation here. You've got this elderly woman lying to homicide detectives for you and trying to throw them off course in a murder investigation.
Grandma could go to jail because she lied for you. Grandma never told me she took you anywhere. I asked Grandma, I said, did you take him anywhere? Grandma says no. I said, did you give him any money? Grandma said no. Grandma took you to Casey because she lied to me. For you, Grandma lied. There's somebody who's working hard, who's trying to take care of her family. Grandma, how old is Grandma? 70? It's not good.
As you just saw there, it was at this point that Tommy started to break down. Through tears, Tommy explained that on the night of January 14th, he was drunk and high on meth and was in desperate need of some money. He was already in Casey to see his girlfriend and remembered his old neighbor Scott, who always seemed to have nice things. Because of this, he decided to break into Scott's house to see if he could find some cash or other valuables to sell. When Tommy arrived at the house that night, Scott and Gretchen weren't home. As we now know, that's because they were at TJ Duvall's house. After heading inside the residence, Tommy made his way into the basement, where he started rooting around through Scott's possessions. At some point, though, Scott and Gretchen had returned unexpectedly. When they did, the situation quickly spiraled out of control. Scott and Tommy started fighting, and when Tommy got the upper hand, Gretchen came to Scott's rescue. Unfortunately, Tommy was able to grab a knife. He killed Gretchen, then killed Scott. In a panic, he said he set the house on fire in order to cover his tracks. He stole a car from a house nearby to get as far away as possible, but due to his intoxicated state, ended up crashing it. That's why he had been forced to steal the second vehicle from Greg Light. Despite the vicious nature of the killings, Tommy claimed that the whole thing had been an accident. He said that he never meant to hurt anyone.
Nothing makes sense to me. I didn't kill him on purpose.
If there were any remaining doubts about Tommy Messina's guilt, these were put to bed when detectives were contacted by the Illinois State Crime Lab. Analysis had finally come back on the blood evidence found in Scott Collins' basement. While the vast majority of the blood at the scene belonged to Scott and Gretchen, it turned out that one other DNA profile was present. It belonged to Tommy Messina. His blood was found on the floor, and his DNA was also found in Gretchen's mouth. In her final act as a loyal companion, Gretchen had helped to ensure that Scott's killer would be brought to justice. Tommy Messina was initially charged with a number of offenses, including aggravated arson, aggravated cruelty to animals, and, of course, murder. However, all of the charges except for the murder charge were dropped when he agreed to accept a plea deal. In April of 2015, he was sentenced to 45 years in prison. At the time of this recording, Tommy Messina remains incarcerated at Illinois' Lawrence Correctional Center. I think this is one of those cases where it's helpful to remind ourselves that not everything that looks suspicious is actually an indicator of guilt. I mean, there were potential suspects and motives branching off in every direction in this investigation, and in the end, it was someone that police had never even considered who turned out to be responsible. Scott's brother Lonnie talked a little bit about this in one of the interviews we came across in our research. In particular, about how difficult and awful it was to have so many people assuming that he never cared about his brother and was only interested in his money. In general, this case got me thinking about how there's almost always more than one way to read or view something. You know, with Lonnie making those calls asking about his brother's life insurance and will, I think most people would admit that that looks pretty suspicious. But on the flip side, grief is a powerful and mysterious thing, and it affects people in different ways. For instance, I've heard from a number of people that have lost someone really close that immediately after it happened, they found themselves consumed with making arrangements. There's a lot to do after someone dies, no matter what the circumstances, and I feel like in a lot of cases, this can almost delay the onset of grief. You know, your brain goes into logistics mode, and it's only after everyone leaves and the funeral and everything is over that the reality of the situation hits you. Just something to think about. The last thing I wanted to bring up is actually kind of eerie. While researching these cases, I always hop on Google and I try to get a familiarity with the area that the crime takes place in. Usually after a little searching, I can find a bunch of important landmarks in the story, including pretty frequently the victim's home. When I found Scott's home, I went into Google Street View and I discovered that there were exactly 2 images that had been taken there. The first was captured last year and shows just a vacant lot where Scott's home used to be. The other, though, was captured in July of 2013, almost exactly 6 months before the murder. It turns out that at the exact moment that the Google car was coming down the road, Scott was actually standing outside his front door. If you look closely enough, you can even see Gretchen there with him, just barely visible in the crack of the half-open door. I honestly can't decide whether it's creepy or kind of quaint for the pair of them to be immortalized in this way. Maybe they were on their way out for a walk together, or maybe they had just returned. Whatever the case, there's something deeply striking about the image of this quiet summer day, knowing of the horror that was to come. Before we wrap up, we'd like to take a second to give a huge shout out to everyone who has made it this far into the video. Seriously, thank you so much for watching. If you found today's upload interesting and informative, we'd be honored if you consider liking and subscribing, as well as hitting the notification bell and selecting all notifications to stay up to date with our latest releases. If you're looking for additional ways to help support the channel, we'd love to have you join us over on Patreon. Patrons get ad-free and early access to all of our content, as well as 4 additional stories per week for each of our Crimes of the Week and Crimes of the Week International videos. You can learn more at patreon.com/crimezone, where you'll also find some of the fine folks whose names are currently on screen. All that being said, we understand that not everyone has the means to support financially, and that's totally okay. We appreciate every like, sub, share, and comment that you send our way. Once again, thanks so much everyone, and take care.